Here today to talk about this theme and delve deeper into this matter is a very special guest. He's an esteemed American Jewish scholar, a leading expert in international law, Princeton University law professor for 40 years. He's a prolific author who has published over 50 books. At 90 years old, he has just published his memoirs titled Public Intellectual, The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim. Citizen Pilgrim meaning one who takes up a life journey to build a better future by addressing the injustices of the present wherever encountered. For example, he visited North Vietnam and met with Prime Minister Pham Van Dong during the Vietnam War. He met with Ayatollah Khomeini and visited Iran during the Islamic Revolution. He met with Nelson Mandela in South Africa at the height of the struggle against apartheid. From 2008 to 2014, he served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights. He recommended that the International Criminal Court investigate Israeli war crimes against the Palestinians. Last month, the ICC finally gave the go-ahead to investigate. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize annually since 2009. It is my great honor to introduce Richard Falk, who will be interviewed by JVP-LA's Rick Chertoff. Rick, take it away.
Yeah, good morning from California, Richard. And I suppose it's much later in the Middle East where you are, Turkey.
Good to be with you, and thank you, Salim, for the introduction.
Richard, I've been reading through your writings and your blog and so forth in the last few days in particular. And it seems clear for anyone that doesn't know, it is clear that international law and the pursuit of peace and justice for nations and for peoples has been your life's passion, as Samir was saying. And we wanted to discuss something here we're calling medical apartheid, the withholding of life-saving medicines by a colonial settler state that's currently endangering the lives of millions of its occupied indigenous children and women and men. And there's a nagging question in the back of my mind that I feel many people would ask, and I can't completely answer. So I'm going to ask you with the deepest respect, because it's somewhat of a challenging question. What can we expect international law to actually accomplish with a country like Israel, which has repeatedly violated major international laws and has seemingly always evaded any consequences for doing so? Is there a practical purpose in these laws that protect oppressed people in a case such as this?
Well, that's an excellent initial question, Rick, and I've thought about it quite a bit. That doesn't mean I have a good answer for it, but in essence, international law is misunderstood as it operates, and it creates both too high expectations and too much of a readiness to dismiss it. What international law, and for that matter, the United Nations can do, is extremely important in the domain that I call symbolic politics. That is, the domain wherein we reach conclusions about legal and moral and even spiritual questions. It is not able to override geopolitical resistance when it comes to implementing international law. And that implementation, in the end, depends on the combination of resistance on the ground and global solidarity initiatives. And that's where the symbolic domain is underestimated and extremely important. It's not so important in intergovernmental relations. Governments make up their mind on the basis of their national interests, selfishly motivated usually, and can sometimes be enlisted on behalf of good causes, but by and large, what brings about dramatic change is the mobilization of people combined with this successful command of the normative height, what I call the normative heights of law and morality. And if you look at the conflicts of the last 75 years, especially the anti-colonial wars, they were all won by the weaker side militarily. And it was a lesson the US should have learned in Vietnam, but didn't. It had total military superiority, yet lost the war. And it lost the war because you had on the one side an extreme nationalist mobilization, and on the other side you had a growing global solidarity movement that included the anti-war activism that occurred back here, back in the United States. So the short answer to your, this is no longer a short answer, but the answer to your question is that international law has a crucial role to play in mobilizing civil society activism, and that crucial role is to create legitimacy for global solidarity initiatives. And it also has an important role to play in putting a country like Israel, or for that matter, the United States, on the defensive normatively. And that's a very bad place to be, because it produces isolation and eventually produces a situation where the stronger side militarily gives up the struggle. This happened in South Africa, which is very analogous to the situation confronting the Palestinians in Israel.
Thank you so much, Richard. That really is very helpful, and takes me back to our title of medical apartheid, and the question of apartheid and the use of the term. Calling Israeli policy towards the indigenous Palestinian majority apartheid, and suggesting Israel is analogous to apartheid South Africa is bitterly denounced, not only by the Israeli state leadership and the Israel lobby here, but also by people who call themselves peace-oriented, but perhaps liberal Zionists, for example, here in the United States. So they say, many of them say, that applying the term apartheid to Israel is defamatory against Israel. Obviously, there's, the state apparatus and the Israel lobby call it anti-Semitic to even criticize Israel. But notwithstanding just this term, they say that it's just a convenient rhetorical device, and just another snarky way to attack poor little Israel for simply maintaining a Jewish state on its way in some future century to a two-state solution, perhaps. So how legitimate do you think the use of the term Israeli apartheid really is?
Well, that again is a searching, crucial question. And one thing I would say to start my response is that Israeli leaders speaking in Hebrew to their own population have, from the time of David Ben-Gurion, said, if we don't come to terms with the Palestinians, we'll be an apartheid state. In other words, it's defamation if others say it. It's a prudent warning if it's said internally in Hebrew. And it's been said by Olmert more recently, and a whole string of prominent Israelis have warned. They're the more liberally inclined in some cases, most cases, but they've warned that the way in which Palestinian people are treated is inevitably going to involve a system of domination that has the characteristics of apartheid. And Israel itself more or less removed ambiguity from the accusation in its 2018 Basic Law, which proclaimed Jewish supremacy, limited official language to Hebrew, and said only the Jewish people have the right of self-determination. I participated in a 2017 study that was commissioned by the UN and caused a furor in the Security Council when it was denounced as defamatory, that very academically, from a very academic view, examined the policies and practices of Israel toward the Palestinian people, not only in the occupied territories, but also in Israel and in relation to the refugee camps and in terms of the involuntary exile experienced by Palestinians. In other words, in the context of Israel, apartheid applies to the people, not just to the territory. And that's a very important distinction to keep in mind. When we come to the situation that has arisen during the pandemic, Israel has been unnecessarily upfront in a way about adopting an apartheid approach, because it's not only that it has withheld the vaccine from the 5 million Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, but it has given the vaccine to the 450,000 or so Israeli settlers living in the same territory. So it has discriminated in a situation of maximum emergency between the Palestinian people and the unlawful settlers. So it's a kind of grotesque exaggeration of a apartheid system of control. And it's magnified by the degree to which Israel, under international humanitarian law, has a special obligation to an occupied people. It's specified in Articles 50 and 55 and 56, I think, in the Fourth Geneva Convention, that the occupying power has a particular obligation toward the civilian society that is occupied, and particularly toward children and pregnant women, disabled people, and especially during a time of epidemic or health emergency. So there really is no reasonable dissent from the conclusion that Israel has seriously violated international humanitarian law, as well as seemingly committed the crime, the international crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute governing the International Criminal Court. And in the background of all of this is the recent decision, a historic decision by the International Criminal Court, that it has the authority to investigate war crimes or international crimes committed on occupied Palestine since 2014. And this this ICC decision probably won't lead to a exploration of the apartheid aspects of uh, Israeli criminality because it's too difficult to gather the appropriate evidence. But it is a validation of the degree to which Israel is being increasingly held to standards of accountability in this symbolic realm. That nothing will happen behaviorally, but it will have an enormous effect, I think, the combination of the way they've handled the pandemic and this ICC decision. It will have an enormous impact on symbolic politics.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that's helpful too. In thinking about this relationship between international law and the vocabulary of international law, Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, as you're probably aware, has called Israeli policy towards the Palestinians generally incremental genocide. And in thinking about this, I remember that there's an old Israeli saying that really sums up Zionist ideology, at least in my mind, which of course, Zionist ideology being the operating system or the DNA of the Israeli state. And it goes like this: more land, less Arabs. That's the saying: more land, less Arabs. So, Jewish Israelis are acutely aware that they're a democratic minority in Palestine and becoming more so every day. Do you believe that preventing Palestinians from getting vaccinations stems from some underlying either desire to have less Palestinians, or maybe it's just inherent that there's an eliminationist tendency in all inherent in all colonial settler states that's at play here? I mean, it does seem kind of counterintuitive that Israel could have not missed an opportunity here to be the wonderful country that they want to be seen as by simply giving medicine to people. And they passed that by. So what do you think is at play here that they would do something that looks so terribly bad, so obviously, to the international community?
Yes, I think the conjecture that you make is a reasonable one. I have no special information, and I'm always reluctant to attribute genocidal intentions without more direct evidence that that is what underlies the policy. I think that it does, without any doubt, express a disregard both for the international legal obligations and for human decency in treating a people that is as vulnerable as the Palestinians have been. And it was in some ways epitomized for me by this statement of the Israeli health minister, that asking him to feel responsibility for the Palestinians is equivalent to asking the Palestinians to feel responsibility for the health of the dolphins in the Mediterranean Sea. And that does have a level of such acute indifference that it could support reasonable concerns of a genocidal character. But I think what's underneath the apartheid dimension here is the sense that you have to remember that the Zionist project succeeded in a period of that European colonialism was collapsing. It, in other words, overcame the flow of history. And in order to overcome the flow of history, you have to deal with two things. One is that the victimized people will resist with all the means at their disposal because they feel a legal and political entitlement to self-determination, and especially self-determination in their own country when they're being displaced for reasons that you say to somehow establish an artificial Jewish majority. It has always been the case. The as you well summarized it, more land, less people, less Arabs. I think that has an almost inbuilt disposition to be dependent on either a genocidal approach that you get rid of, you eliminate the people that are resisting to the extent you can, or you subject them to a system of domination and victimization so their resistance is nullified. And that almost necessitates a reliance on an apartheid type of control that Israel now feels self-confident enough because it has this geopolitical muscles provided by the US to ignore public relations. It can, let Israel be Israel is what the prevailing, I think, ethos in the country, sadly, tragically, has become. And so it's a very discouraging moment for those who would have hoped for some kind of sustainable and just peace between these two peoples.
Yeah. Well, I'll just get to ask you one more question, Richard, and then we're going to open it up to everyone. And I know you've been out of the country for what, the duration of the pandemic?
Yeah, so sort of by accident. I was here in Europe for other reasons, and then it seemed unsafe to fly back to California. And we decided that my wife is Turkish and we have a house here. And so we decided it would be better for us to remain here.
Well, being out of the country for that long, I don't know if you've sensed the extended sigh of relief that I and others sense here politically, but we are so relieved that we're not at the mercy of a psychopath or a fascist authoritarian, that we seemingly have put everyone back to sleep on foreign policy. For example, suddenly a two-state solution seems like a fresh idea to some people, or maybe just the New York Times, or Israeli tourism to Arab oil sheikdoms is suddenly a peace idea. But what is your reaction generally to the Biden-Blinken direction, if that's not too strong a word for it?
Yeah, yes, I think it's very unfortunate, but understandable in a way, that Biden has made seems to have made a deliberate choice to seem as bipartisan as possible when it comes to foreign policy, and therefore not challenge the Republican way of seeing the world, particularly with reference to the Middle East and China, and giving priority to his domestic agenda. And he feels, I think, from a political point of view, that his presidency will rise or fall depending on how he handles the pandemic and an economic recovery in the course of ending the pandemic. So it's much easier because people don't care as much about foreign policy, especially if there's not an active high casualty war going on, as they do about domestic policy when there's a national economic and health emergency. And so it's a political calculation. I think he's carried it beyond what I hoped he would have done, but he's basically seems to have accepted the main ingredients of Trump's incredibly one-sided way of handling Israel-Palestine relations that went beyond the ultra-partisan American approach of earlier presidents. And resurrecting the two-state solution is at best a bad joke, because conditions have been created by Israel for a long time now that make an independent Palestinian sovereign state not in the political cards. They govern as if it's a single integrated state. The West Bank has been substantially subject to de facto annexation over a long period of time now, ever since 1967. And the harshness of the policies and practices seem designed to make it clear, at least internally in Israel and in the occupied territory, that no such state can be established other than a kind of Bantustan that would be not viable and not equal and not sovereign.
Thank you so much, Richard. Samir, I'd like to turn it back to you. And let's see, let's open it up to.
Sure, absolutely.
Whoever.
Okay, well, before, let me thank you, Rick, and thank you, Mr. Falk. Very awesome interview, thank you. The chat is now going to be back on. So I know a few of you have responded to me about questions. I see you, Henry, I see your hand. We're going to get to questions. If you have a question, please type it in the chat and I'll read it out loud. Or type the letter Q in the chat and I'll know to call on you. Or like Henry, you can raise your hand, the little emoji hand raising somewhere. We'll get to as many questions as we can before 60 minutes is up. And again, come back in April for our program where we're also going to hear from a Palestinian woman who survived the Nakba but has been living in a refugee camp in Lebanon, stateless, for almost 73 years. And once again, for those of you who are moved to take action, Karen Hilfman is here to suggest a few ways. Karen?
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Samir. As we study and learn, we also want to take time for direct action. Study and action are different sides of the same coin. Both are necessary to move us to liberation from oppressive systems. As the revolutionary Assata Shakur said, theory without practice is just as incomplete as practice without theory. The two have to go together. We're carving out a few minutes now before our Q&A for 3 action steps related to medical apartheid. The first is making a contribution to Shepherd's Field Hospital, an important Palestinian hospital serving refugee camps, communities, and villages in the Bethlehem area. We like to keep in mind that fundraising is important political work insofar as it transfers resources to help transform institutions. The demands of COVID have been overwhelming, and this hospital has run out of money. They're raising funds now to equip their new hospital building. The GoFundMe link for this fundraiser is in the chat, and we'll also send it in a follow-up email. After the meeting, we invite you to read about the hospital and its needs and make a contribution. We raised $500 after last week's event and hope to at least quadruple that today. Please give as much as you can. We know these are not easy times and everyone's financial situation is different. Whatever you think you can comfortably manage, I urge you to add a few extra dollars on top of that. Thank you, JVP Cleveland, for organizing this fundraiser. Chapters co-sponsoring, in addition to LA, are Central Ohio and Northern New Jersey, and also thanks to the United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network of Ohio. The GoFundMe site will close at the end of March and the time is drawing near. Please also share with your networks about the dire need for medical infrastructure in Palestine and urge them to contribute too. We have a $10,000 goal and are now nearing 4,000. Your help will make a difference. Second, we ask you to urge the US government to intervene. One, by signing a petition. JVP is part of the Invest in Justice Coalition with other Palestinian rights groups, demanding Congress pressure Israel to fulfill its obligation to vaccinate Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. The petition link is also in the chat. It will take just a moment after the meeting for you to sign on. And two, by contacting your legislative reps to sign onto two great letters that Samir had mentioned earlier. Two letters from the House written by Reps Andre Carson, Mark Pocan, and Rashida Tlaib, and one from the Senate by Bernie Sanders, urging Secretary of State Blinken to address both vaccine apartheid and Palestinian human rights. There will be another link in the chat with instructions for doing this. And last, I want to mention an action taken by the US Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel as an inspiration. This year, Israel is awarding its very prestigious Dan David Foundation Prize, located at Tel Aviv University, to Drs. Fauci and 4 colleagues. The US Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott has written a powerful letter to Dr. Fauci and the others, urging them to reject the prize. We'll put the link to this letter in the chat too, so you can read it at your leisure and share it widely with your networks. All of these action items will also come to you in a follow-up email. So if you're not able to grab them now, we'll send it soon. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn you back to Samir for Q&A with Professor Falk.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. All right, let's get to some questions. I have 3 lined up. I have Henry, Beverly, and then Sherna. So when I call on you, please unmute yourself and let's get at it. Henry?
Thank you, Samir, very much. Many thanks goes to Professor Falk. I respect you and your work. My question to you is preceded by a short statement. Benjamin Netanyahu often demands that Palestinians accept Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. In the sense that he asks that or demands that, I ask you, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state, a Jewish supremacist state? And if so, by what right?
That's an important question that is not easy to answer in an authoritative way. What one can say is that the right of self-determination inheres in both peoples, and it must serve to reconcile those rights in the context of Palestine. The Zionist project creates a state that can't satisfy that requirement. And therefore, I think the argument is quite compelling that Israel can't establish, in consistency with international law, a supremacist, Jewish supremacist state. And this seems to me to be fairly authoritative, particularly when it's coupled with the need to suppress those who are not Jews, which means that it is not only a supremacist state, but it has to be an oppressive state, or somehow get rid of the Palestinian minority. It did part of that back quite a number of years ago in the Nakba in 1948, but it cannot, in other words, reconcile existence as a Jewish state with contemporary international law under the political conditions that exist in the country. And to some extent, that was almost acknowledged in the Basic Law of 2018, the Basic Law of Israel of 2018 that I referred to. So I think that the conditions under which Israel was established look toward a two-state partition, which itself was a denial of Palestinian self-determination, but at least it had a some kind of way of addressing the two populations. Since that was never implemented, I do believe one's back in this situation where the only way of creating a legitimate state is to abandon the Zionist claim and be satisfied with a Jewish homeland in Palestine rather than a Jewish state that claims these exclusivist rights. The one final thing I would say is that the claim that Israel rests on, going back to Ben-Gurion, who was not religious himself, is the Bible. It's not a legal claim, it's a biblical claim, and Ben-Gurion was quoted as saying, "The Bible is our instrument." And by that he meant we claim the territory of Palestine based on the biblical promised land image, and that, but that has no bearing on contemporary rights, because almost any existing state would be subject to all sorts of claims resting on spiritual and religious heritage. So the notion of invoking religious heritage in this context seems to me to be a way of obscuring the need to establish an apartheid system in order to maintain stability within Israel.
Thank you very much. Very controversial question as usual. Do you have a quick follow-up, Henry?
Yes, I do. Just a quick follow-up. You claimed that it was not an easy question to answer, but if I were to ask myself if the United States has a right to exist as a white nation, I would say that's an easy question, and the answer is no.
Yes, I think that is, I agree with you.
Excellent. All right, second question coming up from Beverly. Beverly, please mute.
Thank you, Samir. And I just want to preface, and thank you for the this meeting today. I just want to preface my question by a personal note that I had a Fulbright scholarship in Palestine last year, and it was when the pandemic was announced. I was living right at the center of it in Bethlehem. And so I have been in touch with my students and colleagues throughout all of this. And I do have a sense of how very serious the pandemic is there now, even though they had done well, the Palestinian Authority had done well at the beginning of it. And for me, the idea that Israel is withholding vaccine is quite affecting. So my question is, it is wonderful that some of our Congress people, representatives and senators, are writing about this issue of Israel's legal responsibility to provide vaccine or to help provide vaccine. But also, our own laws require that our aid not go to a state with a persistent record of human rights violations. And I haven't heard anyone yet seriously talking about conditioning our aid. So I would like to ask Professor Falk about that.
Well, it's an obviously important issue that you raise, but it all rests on political will. I mean, the law is there and it's clear, but the political will to implement it hasn't existed and still doesn't exist. And it would require a major mobilization to exert sufficient pressure so it becomes relevant to the agenda of enough people in Congress or the White House so that they would seriously entertain that issue with all the consequences that would follow from it, which would be a serious undermining of the so-called special relationship and the unconditional support and all of the things we've been hearing about from the new Secretary of State. I just want to add one element that I should have mentioned in talking about the shocking disregard of Palestinian well-being, that Israel, despite withholding the vaccine from the Palestinians under occupation who have a right to it, has been engaging in overseas vaccine diplomacy by sending doses to countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and I think a couple of other countries, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Incidentally, none of them have very good democratic credentials. But to engage in that kind of diplomacy while you're denying the Palestinian people the access to the health vaccines that they need, as your comment suggested, and as they are entitled to by law and morality. And this is further accentuated by the fact that finally Israel has allowed vaccine doses to be given to 50,000 Palestinians, but only because they have work permits to work in either settlements or in Israel itself, which means that those vaccines are given because they don't want these people to be spreading to the Jewish settlers or to Jews living in Israel. So the record is so unnecessarily incriminating for Israel that it's hard to explain how the Israeli public, let alone the leadership, tolerates this way of presenting itself to the world.
Thank you. Next question comes in the chat from Sherna to Richard. Do you have any suggestions for how the BDS campaigns can mobilize more effectively to pressure groups and local governments to divest from those companies that are complicit in Israeli apartheid?
And can I say something, Salim? Richard, here, I'd like you to address. The situation has changed since some of us started, for instance, the divestment campaign in California with PERS. But the way the situation has changed, and for instance, with the ICC taking up the case, do you think that now is the time where we could use international law more effectively to go back to divestment campaigns?
Yes, I do. I do, and particularly the way in which Israel, and particularly Netanyahu and other Israeli political leaders, have reacted to a very reasonable International Criminal Court decision, because it only applies to investigation, and it also implicates Hamas for its use of indiscriminate rockets in the 2014 incursion in Gaza. So to call this pure anti-Semitism is such an evasion of the true challenge posed by this ICC decision that it should make any reasonable person act in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And BDS, you might remember, during the anti-apartheid South African context, was often criticized, including at my university, by some of the members of the Board of Trustees, because South Africa was a strategic ally during the Cold War. But no one cast doubt on the legitimacy of supporting a nonviolent action like BDS. And it was, people criticized it as being imprudent and hurting the Africans more than the white people. A lot of other things were said, but there was none of this effort to smear those that engaged in support of the anti-apartheid campaign by endorsing or even demonstrating in favor of a BDS set of initiatives. And we should remember that the South African leadership recalculated their own interests after they became subject to this combination of the global solidarity movement and the internal efforts to make the country ungovernable, which were quite successful in parts of the area. They didn't have a moral awakening, the leadership, but they had a sense that they would be better off with a constitutional democracy that was multiracial in character than they would trying to maintain apartheid in that kind of international atmosphere. And one hopes that it may take time, but I feel that that's the direction that the struggle on behalf of a just and sustainable peace in Israel-Palestine must take. There's no alternative.
Richard, Selim, can I ask a favor of Richard? As we now start, hopefully, to mobilize on the ground again and not just virtually, it would be wonderful if you might write a short piece, a new short piece, talking about the ways in which people can start using the ICC status and international law generally to try and initiate divestment campaigns again, the way they're almost flourishing in Europe compared to here. I would appreciate it personally greatly. Thank you, Richard, for all you do.
Good. I'll try to do that.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent request. Thank you. Okay, next question comes from Ken, who's going to be hijacking Karen's Zoom screen.
I wanted to expand on the question of access to vaccine, just slightly off topic, by mentioning that the less affluent countries are unable to produce vaccines on their own because the World Trade Organization intellectual property agreements prevent the patents from being expanded to those countries. So I think anything that we can do along the lines of challenging that is, again, really important in helping us to undo COVID.
Yes, I think that's an important observation. I don't know enough about it, though, to give an important answer. Uh, the people have spoken about suspending the patents for the duration of the pandemic, but I don't know where such an authority would reside to suspend patents, because it would involve a taking of property without uh, compensation. So it would have to possibly depend, at least in some countries, on establishing a state of emergency that would allow that kind of authority to be exercised. But as I say, I haven't looked into it in any effective way, so I wouldn't take my words too seriously.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question in the chat from Dennis Cortoyer. Sorry, I don't want to mess up your name again. Professor Falk, you have just published a memoir, Public Intellectual, Life of a Citizen Pilgrim. Buy it, find it on audiobooks, do something with that, with your money and support. That's from me, which deals extensively with how, as a secularized Jew growing up in Manhattan, you became over the years involved with these issues, paid a price, but remained engaged and motivated. Would you talk about that journey?
Well, that's difficult to talk about in a very briefly. I mean, the question itself gives the essential storyline. As I say, I grew up in an atmosphere which didn't take these identity issues very seriously, and it was only as a young adult that I encountered friends that influenced me in one way or another, and I was aware through my early post-student phase that this was a very delicate issue in American life, and that touching the Israel-Palestine question from a critical perspective was touching a third rail in American political life. And so I was reluctant, involved with the Vietnam War for a long time, but became very good friends with Edward Said, who, as most of you must know, was a leading intellectual, the leading Palestinian intellectual. And he used to tease me about being so involved with all these other issues and not addressing the Palestinian challenge. And so I can say, partly by my own sense of growing dissatisfaction with what I understood Israel to be doing to the Palestinian people, and really as a destructive force in the region beyond its borders, plus this sense of embarrassment about not following my values where the terrain was difficult. And the terrain proved difficult. I had not so much problems as a professor at Princeton, but when I became UN Special Rapporteur, I was attacked in a defamatory way repeatedly by UN Watch, which is a kind of Zionist front NGO that operates in Geneva, and there's another one in New York, UN Monitor. And this was unpleasant, produced death threats and other things that one would rather avoid in life. But at the same time, it brought me into contact with some wonderful Palestinian people, and even though I was overly attacked in this country, I was probably overly praised elsewhere. So there was a kind of emotional equilibrium established through this engagement, and I've maintained it since I left the UN, and it exposed to me also the weakness of liberals in ways that I sensed before, but came to understand much more vividly during this period of involvement, and the degree to which liberals want to have it both ways. They want to be seen as good as long as it doesn't affect their portfolio or their ideological interests. And so it's been a learning experience for me and important human experience to have this opportunity to be in close contact with many Palestinians and people in the region whose struggles have been inspirational in various ways for me. So I have no regrets. I have a few wounds, but no regrets.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it is the top of the hour, the end of our 60-minute program, but we do have about 3 more questions. I'll ask Dr. Falk if he's willing to stay on for a few more minutes to answer 1 or 2 of them.
Sure.
Excellent. Thank you. For those who have to leave, thank you for coming. We're going to send out a follow-up with some action items and just some more information. We'll just hit to the next question. Right now, I know we have next in line is Esty. Do you want to add? I think you're up. Unmute, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Falk, for your time today. It's been a great program, and it's wonderful to see so many friends who we haven't been able to see in person for so long, including Don Pagler, who would be a great person for a future event. He is a survivor of Israel's attack on the USS Liberty and a great friend to JVP-LA and Middle East in Focus, as is Dr. Falk. My very quick question is, there is some people who are quite worried about the ICC and that we finally got to this point where they're going to investigate. They're worried about the fact that the leadership is about to change, and Israel seems very excited about the upcoming leader. And is that bad news for the relief that Palestinians, that we hope they might receive from the court?
By leader, you mean the change of prosecutor? Is that?
I'm sorry. Thank you. The prosecutor.
Yes, it's a British barrister named Karim Khan, I believe. And not too much is known about him. He's represented a variety of people and governments over the course of his career, and apparently is a very good jurist, but is undoubtedly will be under severe pressure. And the fact that the UK supported him is not an encouraging sign. But as I tried to stress, what's important about this ICC decision is the symbolic, historic impact it will have and is having. And even if nothing further occurs, it will have validated allegations of criminality, and the pushback will be seen widely as a way of not engaging with a substantive defense, because there is no reasonable defense. And so I'm grateful for your question, Esty, and good to see you.
You as well. Thank you, Dr. Falk.
Thank you. Before I get to the next question, I did skip over one thing in the chat before Esty's question. Tony Litwinko offers us that in the last edition of the Washington Report, it includes a form letter postcard to be addressed to President Biden and to your senators and representatives objecting to this very financial support for Israel. So there's another way to contact your political leaders, and we'll also hope to send out that information in our follow-up email. Now we have another question from Samir, not me. Samir, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm on.
You are on, sir.
All right. Hi, Dr. Falk. My question is, are we going to see a democratic state of Palestine in our lifetime?
My crystal ball is rather dark. I hope so. I hope so. And the fact that it is a possibility is part of the reason that these authoritarian Arab regimes are nervous about the Palestinian self-determination and have always been. I mean, it's become more obvious recently, and especially with the normalization agreements, but there's always been a Arab fear, a fear by the regimes, not by the people, not by the Arab peoples, by the regimes, that Palestine would become the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, the phrase that's always used by American politicians to describe Israel. But Palestine might fool everyone by becoming the first truly democratic country in the region if they manage to gain their right of self-determination.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This one comes from the chat. It came to me from Lynn Siegel from Boulder, Colorado. Is this the most important issue of mankind, including climate change, and why?
Well, I don't know that one can compare issues of such magnitude. They're important. They're crucially important in different ways. I would say that for Americans, the scandalous way of handling the Israel-Palestine relationship is the most important moral challenge that the country faces internationally. The challenges toward minorities in the country, toward the Native Americans and so on. But I would regard the way in which the US has used its geopolitical, financial, and military power to support this repressive colonial settler state is a shocking disregard of elementary law and morality.
Thank you. One last question from Dick Platkin. Is U.S. government policy toward Israel an exception or part of a larger policy in the Middle East?
Well, it's both. It's an exception in the sense that it's a more intense example of supporting a repressive status quo, but it's consistent with the behavior toward other oppressive regimes, most notably Saudi Arabia, and its hostile approach to Iran ever since it had its revolution. So the Middle East policies, which were guided not only by its relationship to Israel, but also to oil and energy resources that had been extremely important in earlier, and also its reaction to what it viewed as a setback geopolitically in Iran are all part of an integrated failure to allow people to determine their own destinies. And an issue really is this question of self-determination and a realization that the colonial era has moved into history, and to keep it alive requires brute force and a repressive set of policies and practices.
Thank you very much. I have one personal question before we let everyone go. Since you just wrote your memoirs, is there one particular world leader or individual that left like the deepest impression on you? And who would that be and why?
Well, the obvious answer is Mandela. He had a moral radiance in person that lived up to that sense that he was had a quality of a human quality that sort of transcended his political role, and it was very extraordinary opportunity. I met him under strange circumstances where I had been asked to write a speech that he gave, and he knew I had written it, and so it was strange to hear my words coming out of his mouth. And it was a very memorable experience for me there. Meeting with Khomeini was also, in its way, something that I recall. I can almost recall the exchanges over a 2 or 3 hour period with him. He was a quite extraordinary presence, and not somebody whose policies or even temperament I would endorse, but the opportunity of having that kind of existential relationship with him at a time before he was fully, it was the last day he was in Paris before he returned to Iran, was also a very important experience in my life.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you for the extra few minutes for answering our questions. Thank you all for being here. This 2-part series was really enlightening. If you haven't read the book, if you haven't gotten to the book, please go get it. Public Intellectual, The Life of Citizen Pilgrim. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Falk. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our co-sponsors. And you'll get a follow-up from us soon. Thank you. Goodbye. See you next month.
Thank you. And thank you, JVP, for doing wonderful work for now many years. And it's always a pleasure and an honor for me to have contact with what you are doing. So I applaud it from a distance.
Thank you. And hopefully you'll accept our invitation back one of these days soon.
Sure. Hopefully I'll be geographically closer.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.
Take care, Tony.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Dr. Falk, again and again.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Tony.
Hi, Dr. Falk.
Bye-bye.
Bless you, Dr. Falk.
Thank you.